Who's paying and who's profiting from the conflict in Ukraine? Arms manufacturers see their dividends skyrocket as national budgets allocate more and more for weapons. Is it money well spent, or do the most vulnerable pay the price? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the cost of the Ukraine conflict. Now, earlier this week, a new report highlighted the grim impact of the Ukraine conflict on the global economy. The OECD says by the end of this year, Russia's attack will cost the world $2.8 trillion in lost productivity. The head of the organization summed it up by saying,
"The world is paying a very heavy price for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine."
Well, the United Nations had another way of looking at it. It estimates that the Ukraine conflict is exposing 1.5 billion people in 94 countries to food, energy, and financial crises. In real terms, that means the losers of this conflict are those who can't afford to feed themselves. And while humanitarian aid is helping in places like Eastern Europe and Central Asia, others are feeling neglect. In Somalia, for instance, malnutrition has become rampant among children. This is how one aid worker described their desperate situation.
The burden of food shortages is directly related to the fact that the world has turned its back on Somalia to focus on Ukraine. Most of the aid to Somalia come from the West, but now their attention and aid has been diverted to Ukraine. This is of great concern.
But while children in Somalia are starving, it's the other absolute extreme in the boardrooms of the world's biggest oil and defense companies. Since the conflict began, arms manufacturers have seen their profits spike. In June, their share price increased between 20 and 120%. And while most of Europe is worrying about keeping the heat on this winter, energy companies are seeing record profits, so much so that the UN Secretary General lashed out.
It is immoral for oil and gas companies to be making record profits from this energy crisis on the back of the poorest people and communities, and at a massive cost to the climate.
Well, it's important to note that none of this is new. In fact, Antonio Guterres' scorn came nearly 70 years after a similar warning was given by a military general who went on to become the U.S. president. This is how Dwight Eisenhower described the real cost of war.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed.
So with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, who is winning and who is losing when it comes to the conflict economy? Joining me now to debate that are from Kiev, Glen Grant. He's a former advisor to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and an expert with the Baltic Security Foundation. From New York, we have William Hartung. He's a senior research fellow focusing on the arms industry for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And from Moscow is Ekaterina Chimiris, a political analyst and associate professor of political science at Russia's Financial University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Glenn, the United States has always had a huge budget for defense spending, and some see it as more crucial than ever to build and spend on weapons because of what's happening right now where you are. Why does the U.S. need that level of arms investment?
Well, the first thing is that we've actually forgotten how much we need to spend on defense over the last 20 years. It's been nice and peaceful, relatively. But the recent weeks have shown clearly that actually when there's nation-to-nation war, that countries have to have a certain level of defense spending that is the very basic, because it's a government's prime task is the security of its own country. And I mean, you can see from the what's been happening that the Europeans certainly just didn't have enough money spending on defense in the last 20 years at all. So they're playing catch up. And the war has exposed that some of the American capabilities are not as good as they need to be for a war of this type. Certainly, I mean, America has always said that it should be able to fight on two fronts. And of course, the second front at the moment they would consider is what do we do if we have to fight China with Taiwan? And they must be stretched at the moment because they've given a huge amount of support, weapons and equipment to Ukraine, and some of the things now their coffers will be a bit on the dry side.
Right. I'm specifying the U.S. in my question to you because it is, the primary supplier, really, of weapons to the Ukraine now. And unfortunately, I think, in your opinion, you see it as unfortunate that the House GOP leader is saying that they want no more massive spending on Ukraine. And in fact, if they take the House, the Republican Party, they're going to stop this, what they see as a blank check for Ukraine. I mean, do you think that's a positive or negative development then?
No, it's a negative development because if this war goes badly, then it's quite clear that it's going to come back and bite America, whichever way it goes. And they'll have to go and fight somewhere because Russia is not about to stop if it wins in Ukraine. So this is as much an American problem as it is a Ukrainian problem or a European problem. And I know that the GOP want to stop this, but then you have to question their motives as well. What is actually behind the way that they're thinking? It can't just be that they want to have America first, because they can't be so unintelligent that they don't understand that this is going to bite them. Just the same way it bit them in the First World War, and the same way it'll bite them in the Second World War, after the Second World War.
William, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. I mean, what do you think is actually wrong with how much the U.S. allocates to the Pentagon budget and defense spending? I mean, you actually published an article about how big defense budgets scam the taxpayer.
Yes, well, the United States is spending at almost historic levels, higher than Vietnam or Korea, higher than the peak of the Cold War, $850 billion a year if Congress has its way. So this is far more than is needed for defensive purposes. Yes, weapons need to be supplied to Ukraine to help it defend itself. But the kinds of weapons that are at issue, anti-tank weapons, short and medium-term anti-aircraft weapons, are not relevant to a war with China. If the United States gets into a ground war with China, it's all over. It's too nuclear powered. The Taiwan issue has to be dealt with politically by supporting the One China policy, through dialogue amongst Taiwan, China, and the United States. The United States already has a huge military presence in Asia, and it also has a commitment to global terror. It's got 800 military bases around the world. The real problem with U.S. policy is it's far too ambitious. It talks about basically being able to go anywhere in the world and fight on short notice, when allies should be taking up a lot of that burden. There's also a huge nuclear buildup when we already have more than enough for nuclear deterrence. There's a huge bureaucracy that does nothing to increase fighting power. There's weapons like the F-35 that don't work properly, that are the most expensive weapons programs in the history of the Pentagon. So there should be streamlining, there should be a more restrained strategy, there should be more reliance on allies. And I think all of that can be done while still supporting Ukraine, while still making sure that we don't have a war in Asia.
And critics also say, William, that this really just allows private shareholders to profit off war. To what extent is that true?
Oh, it's completely true. The companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and others, their profits are surging. And rather than reinvest that money in their factories and their research and development, they're buying back shares, which basically pumps up the share value, helps the shareholders, helps the executive. So they're basically laughing all the way to the bank because they're about making money. Defense strategy is not their first priority, and this is clear if you look at the kinds of countries that they're willing to supply arms to, like Saudi Arabia, which has caused devastation in Yemen, like Egypt, one of the most repressive regimes in the world, Nigeria, the Philippines. Supplying Ukraine, as the industry has tried to wrap itself in the flag and say, well, we're the arsenal of democracy. But in most of the world, they're the arsenal of repression. And they'll basically will sell to anybody the U.S. government allows them to sell to. And they will lobby the U.S. government to make sure they can sell to as many countries as possible. They will hire former government officials. lobby for them. And so forth.
Sir, I hate to say this, but I think you're confusing two or three things at the same time. That it doesn't matter whether this money is being overspent. It doesn't matter whether America is inefficient with its defense. What matters is winning the war against Russia. You can sort the other things out afterwards. And yes, I agree, they are inefficient. I've been to America and I've seen its inefficiency. And yes, maybe people are making a bit of money, but you have to take the thing that is important first. A country is raping and pillaging Ukraine. And sorry, your military knowledge about what weapons are needed is not as sharp as perhaps it could be. They need proper military
already
weapons.
Supports Ukraine. The U.S. is already
yes,
supporting
they do support Ukraine, but they're not supporting Ukraine enough for what actually could happen to America afterwards if they don't get this right.
Russia has shown its weakness in Ukraine. Russia is
Doesn't
not going to
matter.
win.
It's not
Russia is
stopped
not a
yet.
threat to NATO.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you're not a threat, I'm sitting down in a bunker under a hotel because there's a missile attacks in Kiev at the moment.
I understand, yes, in Ukraine, but they are not a threat to NATO nations. They are not going to march around the world. They are too weak to do so. They are far too weak to do so.
I'm sorry.
The point is to stop the war in Ukraine. The point is not that they're going to be a global military power.
Sorry, are they no longer a nuclear power?
They're a nuclear power, which is why we have to be careful about not escalating in Ukraine.
Okay.
You do not have any control over escalation in Ukraine. This is a Russia matter. Russia has to be beaten. It's not about escalation. If Russia decides to escalate, they will escalate whether America wants it to or not. If they want to put a missile and a rocket onto the top of Riga or of Estonia, they will do so because they want to. You can't stop it in America. The only way to stop this is to stop Russia as quickly as possible at source.
Okay, at this point, I would like to get Ekaterina into the conversation. And Ekaterina, do tell us what you make of not just the exchange you just heard, but also do bring us up to speed on where Russia stands now on its own defense spending and investment in this conflict. Is it profiting to any extent, or is this really draining the Russian economy and its people?
Well, thank you very much. Let me just give you some insight from Russian Federation. And of course, the main payers for this war in Russia, as well as other countries and participants, will be common people and businesses that produce national GDP. And if we look at the military industry, when does this industry earn money? When they sell weapons somewhere outside the country, usually abroad. And when the country is using these weapons themselves, they just spend resources. Of course, in Russian Federation, the so-called party of war is winning now because during the last several years, Russian Federation was looking at the process of NATO trying to add some other countries, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. That's why the idea was to protect Russia from NATO. That's why the idea that Russia should protect the so-called Russian world is very popular now. If we speak about the economic issues, of course, the Russian economy will change dramatically. But the main idea that I would like to tell you is that just keep in mind one fact, that all the generations in Russia had an experience of some economic conflict. That's why when our Western partners consider that there will be some social protests or something like this due to economic reasons, I would say that it is a big mistake.
Okay.
Russian people are used to economic crises and they know how to manage with them.
Right. So, I mean, you're saying, Ekaterina, that yes, this is a strain on the Russian taxpayer right now, but Russians, you feel, generally support this conflict effort. this special operation, as they still term it, and that they will essentially adapt no matter what the economic toll is taken on the Russian people. Let me go back to William Hartung at this point, because as for the economic argument and the strain that it puts on the U.S. economy in particular, you know, while some manage to reap huge profits out of the war economy, many others do have to pay a price. There are certain programs that will not get a part of the budget because there's an increase in defense spending. But then some argue that, you know, it was World War II, for example, that helped lift the United States out of the Great Depression, creating jobs via, you know, a boom in manufacturing. And right now we're seeing another economic crisis of sorts globally. So why can't the U.S. economy somehow benefit in the same way from this increase in military defense spending?
Well, it's a different military industry from what it was during World War II. It's much more capital intensive. There's many more partnerships where the jobs actually occur in other countries, not the United States. Almost any other form of investment would create more jobs than spending on the military. 40% more for infrastructure and green energy, more than twice as much for education. So there's other ways to spend the money. And of course, the other thing is there's other threats that are not military, like climate change. And the US is not investing nearly enough in addressing that. So I think there's got to be a hard look at what's necessary for defense versus what's necessary to line the pocket of defense contractors. And I think it's dangerous to allow the Pentagon budget to basically get a free ride when there's other national priorities that are just as important to people's safety and security.
Just give me a better idea then, William, of where you mentioned education, for example, but what exactly do you think should be the priorities? Because, you know, others, as Glen's going to argue, this is the Ukraine conflict right now is the priority globally. This is a question of U.S. national interest and the national security interest of basically the Western world. So tell us where the U.S. suffers, do you think? You know, who are the vulnerable that are paying for this reprioritization of what's needed in the U.S.?
You know, I think the issues that are of equal importance are things like climate change, which is an existential threat, which is with us now. And if we divert money to the military, using Ukraine as an excuse, because frankly, a lot of the money that the industry wants to invest has nothing to do with defending Ukraine. They're using it as an opportunity to jack up the Pentagon budget for pet projects that they've wanted for years. There's no question the United States should help Ukraine defend itself, but also we have to take a look at Russia with a cold, clear eye. They're a nuclear power, yes, but conventionally, given their performance in Ukraine, it's pretty clear they cannot threaten NATO allies. They can't go on a global military march. They're deterred to a significant degree from using their long-range nuclear weapons because the United States is also a nuclear power. So I think we should focus on how to stop the Russian invasion and suppression of Ukraine and not blow it up into this larger global issue where we're going to be spending money on things that aren't the most important priority.
Glenn, what's so wrong with William's argument there?
Well, it's just confusing things. I mean, climate change is not raping any women. It's not raping any children. Climate change is not castrating men. Climate change is not leaving us with graves with bodies in it with heads cut off. And I think we've just got to get some focus.
Well, that's an emotional argument. That's an emotional argument. We're already helping Ukraine defend itself.
I don't disagree.
We are already
helping. Yeah, but you're not helping. You're not understanding that you can't just say we're helping and just throw it away as though this is going to actually to solve the problem. The problem has to be solved properly, because if we don't, Russia will be back. I was talking to one of the senior generals this morning, before we went down into the bunker, and his line was quite clear. As soon as we finish this, we have to balance ourselves because Russia will be back if we don't beat it properly. And this is a fact. And I'm sorry, but climate change is not going to affect that. We have to fix the Russia problem first. Then we can sort out the defense of America and overspending and waste on other things that you're talking about. But we've got to get the priorities right and in the right order, is all I'm saying to you, sir.
I want to ask.
Well, the two are not unrelated. The two are not unrelated because the Ukraine conflict is being used to jack up spending on all kinds of things in the Pentagon that have absolutely nothing to do with confronting Russia or with fighting the war in Ukraine. And that's a big part of the problem. So they are related.
I'd like to get back to Ekaterina at this point because, looking at the economy from Russia's side, yes, you say Russians will adapt. They're used to economic hardship. But the bottom line is, if the money runs out, it runs out. And Russia is under pretty severe sanctions right now. And they are stretching their budgets by spending on this conflict. What happens when the economy and the budget is just stretched too thin?
Well, if we speak about economic processes in Russia, we should also take into account the situation in the North Eurasia. We have some partners, still have some partners in Eurasian region. And I would say that from the point of view of economy, and a lot of Russian economists say so also, that the economy will not be collapsed in Russia. It will develop somehow. We will find some variants to survive in this really difficult situation. But what I would like to propose is that we should not concentrate only on the Ukrainian conflict. Of course, it is a great tragedy, not only for Ukrainian people, but also for most of Russian people. But at the same time, we should also look at different international actors. And these are all very complex situation, very complex international situation, which is not only focused on the Ukrainian crisis.
I'm not sure exactly how that factors in, but I do still want to look at the Russian economy and try to understand how it can continue to stretch its budgets this far on military spending. What are they looking at as far as fossil fuels? Are you looking for that private industry to make, as many are around the world, more massive profits that will have to go back into feeding this conflict?
Well, Russia is trying to find new partners in other regions, rather international regions. They are looking at Africa, they are looking in the Middle East, Central Asia, China, Turkey, and so on and so forth. They are trying to go back from the European Union and Western countries and to develop economic ties, new economic ties with other international regions, other countries. Of course, these all are countries of the third world without any developed economies. But still, Russia is trying to be the leader of these developing countries. And this is the main idea for Russian politicians now.
Okay. I mean, William, having heard that, do you think the Russian economy can realistically move and survive in that direction and thrive even, as Ekaterina seems to see it's possible, by going, into the developing world where they still do have allies willing to work with them and help boost their economy? Is that a distinct possibility, that Russia can be just fine, no matter what the cost?
I don't think so. I think people may be willing to weather quite a bit of economic suffering, and they may get some markets outside of the U.S. and Europe, but it's not going to be the same as it was before sanctions. So, maybe the economy won't collapse, but it's certainly not going to thrive under these conditions. And a lot of it has to do with if they can continue to sell oil, which they've been doing at a discount. Countries like Saudi Arabia have been collaborating with them for their, the displeasure of the U.S. government and Congress and so forth. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a tough road. The question is almost more political. Are they willing to accept the economic hardship?
But you've mentioned again, this all works out very well for energy providers, fossil fuel companies, really. They are making record profits, as we said, in some cases, off the back of this suffering.
Exactly. And I think the Saudi case is interesting because, of course, they waged a war in Yemen where, due to direct and indirect causes, almost 400,000 people have died. And the United States has been arming them to do that. It would be simple enough to cut off those arms, pressure them for a peace agreement, much simpler than the huge challenge of helping Ukraine push back the Russians. And yes, U.S. administrations have yet to be willing to do that, although there is now a strong push in Congress to do just that. So I think that's another thing, is that there's there is a larger global picture where the same companies profiting from arming Ukraine are profiting from arming repressive regimes around the world.
Glen Grant, quick 30 seconds for your final words. Yeah,
can I just add there that actually we were doing quite nicely until Russia invaded Georgia, and that Russia was actually trading exceptionally well with fossil fuels into the NATO countries and making a healthy profit out of it. So it's actually Russia that stopped itself doing this, not the West. And, I think people really need to understand this.
Okay. Glen Grant, William Hartung, and Ekaterina Chimiris, I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.